Before we begin, if you find yourself enjoying these peculiar tales of sleepy villages, and their even sleepier inhabitants, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more wonderfully boring bedtime stories. Now, let us drift into the first chapter of our story. What happened when the town gossip knew less than everyone else? Chapter 1. The gossip's morning routine. The village of Drowsy Hollow was a place where time moved like molasses dripping from a reluctant spoon. Its inhabitants, a collection of superstitious souls with a penchant for dramatics, thrived on two things: routine and rumor. And no one embodied this marriage of monotony and mischief quite like Edwina Plum, the town gossip. Edwina's mornings began before the roosters could even muster the energy to crow. She rose with the precision of a pocket watch, her bony fingers wrapping around a chipped teacup as she perched by her window, eyes sharp as a hawk's. If hawks were nearsighted and prone to jumping to conclusions. The view from her cottage was unremarkable: a muddy lane, a drowsy cow, and the occasional wandering chicken. But to Edwina, it was a stage upon which the grand theater of village life unfolded. Her first task was to observe. Observation in Edwina's mind was an art form, though her interpretations were more abstract than most. A neighbor stepping out to fetch firewood became a clandestine meeting with a secret lover. A baker yawning as he kneaded dough was evidence of a scandalous all-night gambling habit. A cat stretching on a fence post? Clearly an omen of impending doom. By the time the village stirred to life, Edwina had already assembled a mental catalogue of half-truths and wild speculations, each more outrageous than the last. She documented none of it, of course. Writing things down was far too reliable, and Edwina preferred her facts malleable. Like dough, she could twist into whatever shape suited the day's narrative. Her next stop was the well, the unofficial hub of Drowsy Hollow's rumor mill. Here, under the guise of fetching water, though her bucket was always suspiciously empty, she would plant the seeds of her latest theories. Today she arrived just as old Mrs. Thistleby was adjusting her shawl. "Good morning, Agnes," Edwina trilled, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "You look terribly pale. I do hope you're not coming down with that dreadful fever that's been going around." Mrs. Thistleby, who had never felt better in her life, blinked. "What fever?" "Oh, you haven't heard." Edwina leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "3 families over in Willowbrook have taken ill. Dreadful business. High fevers. Hallucinations. Some say it's the work of witchcraft." This was, of course, entirely fabricated. Willowbrook was a perfectly healthy village 10 miles away, and the only fever anyone had experienced lately was from Old Tom's questionable homebrewed ale. But within minutes, the news had spread like butter on hot toast, and by noon the village was abuzz with talk of curses and contaminated well water. Edwina moved on to the blacksmith shop, where young Jeremiah was hammering away at a horseshoe. She tutted loudly. "Working so hard, Jeremiah? One might think you're saving up to run away." Jeremiah, who had no such plans, frowned. "What?" "Oh, nothing, nothing," Edwina said airily, waving a hand. "Only that I heard Bessie Miller's father is looking for a husband for her. A hard-working lad like you would be quite the catch." This, too, was nonsense. Bessie Miller was 12 years old and far more interested in chasing frogs than husbands. But by supper time, Jeremiah was avoiding the Miller's house like it was haunted, and Bessie's father was scratching his head over why the blacksmith's boy kept blushing and tripping over his own feet. And so the day went, Edwina weaving her web of misinformation with the skill of a spider who had long since stopped caring whether her prey was real or imagined. By evening, the village was in a delightful uproar over a dozen crises that existed solely in Edwina's mind. But what Edwina didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that today was the day the universe had decided to play a little joke on her. For while she had been busy inventing stories about everyone else, something truly peculiar had been happening right under her nose. And it was something even the great Edwina Plum hadn't seen coming. The next morning, when Edwina took her usual place by the window, teacup in hand, she would find that, for the first time in her life, she was the one utterly embarrassingly out of the loop. But that, of course, is a story for another chapter. Chapter 2. The rumor mill begins to turn. The market square of Drowsy Hollow was, on the best of days, a place of mild chaos. Farmers hawked vegetables with the enthusiasm of carnival barkers. Children darted between stalls like overexcited squirrels, and the occasional goat wandered in, convinced it was invited. But today, thanks to Edwina Plum, the square was primed for something far more entertaining. Total delightful nonsense. Edwina arrived early, as was her habit, basket swinging from her arm with an air of false innocence. She had spent the morning refining her latest theory, a particularly juicy piece of imagined scandal, and she was eager to set it loose upon the unsuspecting villagers. Her target today was the fishmonger, a burly man named Gregor, who was, by all accounts, the least interesting person in Drowsy Hollow. But Edwina had a gift for turning even the dullest clay into scandalous pottery. She sidled up to his stall, where Gregor was cheerfully gutting a trout. "Good morning, Gregor," she said, her voice laced with the kind of sympathy one reserves for funerals and failed soufflés. Gregor, who had not once in his life been the subject of sympathy, paused mid-gut. "Hey, I heard about your situation," Edwina continued, shaking her head as if the situation in question were tragic indeed. Gregor blinked. "What situation?" Edwina leaned in. "You know, the investigation part." Now, there was no investigation. There had never been an investigation. Gregor's greatest crime in life was occasionally overcharging for haddock. But the word hung in the air like a bad smell, and Gregor's face went the color of undercooked lobster. "But what investigation?" "Oh, come now," Edwina tutted. "The whole village is talking about it. They say the magistrate's men have been asking questions. Something smuggled goods?" She said this last part in a whisper so loud it could have been heard in the next county. Gregor's knife clattered to the table. "Smuggled? I've never—" Edwina patted his arm. Of course. I'm sure it's all a misunderstanding. But you might want to, lay low for a while." With that, she drifted away, leaving Gregor in a state of existential terror. By lunchtime, the news had mutated. Gregor wasn't just under investigation. He was already in league with a notorious band of river pirates. By mid-afternoon, the pirates had become foreign spies, and Gregor was now a secret agent for a distant kingdom, plotting to overthrow the local magistrate. By evening, the story had ballooned to include hidden treasure, a cursed amulet, and at least one ghostly accomplice. Meanwhile, Gregor had locked himself in his cellar, convinced the magistrate's men were moments away from kicking down his door. His wife, utterly bewildered, had to reassure 3 separate neighbors that no, her husband was not a pirate. And no, they did not own a cursed amulet. Though she admitted, after a glass of sherry, that the ghost bit would explain the strange noises in the attic. Edwina, pleased with her morning's work, moved on to her next victim. The miller's wife, a formidable woman named Hester, who had once chased a tax collector off her property with a broom. Hester was kneading dough when Edwina approached, her expression the picture of innocent concern. "Hester, dear," Edwina began, "I couldn't help but notice how tired you look." Hester, who had slept like a log, scowled. "I'm not tired." "Oh, but you must be," Edwina pressed. "After all, with the incident to you last night, I'm surprised you're even standing." Hester's dough-punching fist froze mid-air. "What incident?" Edwina feigned shock. "You mean you haven't heard?" "Oh, Hester, I thought surely someone would have told you by now." "Told me what tea?" Hester barked, flour flying from her hands like a miniature snowstorm. Edwina lowered her voice to a hush. "The mill wheel. It stopped at midnight. They say it was unnatural. This was, of course, absurd. The mill wheel had not stopped. Mill wheels, as a rule, do not stop at midnight unless someone has gone to the trouble of stopping them, and no one in Drowsy Hollow was that ambitious. But Hester's face went pale, because if there was one thing the villagers respected besides gossip, it was a good supernatural rumor. Within the hour the story had spread. The mill wheel had halted at the stroke of 12, spun backward 3 times, and let out a groan like a dying man. By dusk, the tale had grown teeth. The groan was now a full-bodied scream, and the wheel had allegedly written a cryptic message in the river mud. No one could agree on what the message said, but the most popular interpretation was, "I beware, the bready." Hester, meanwhile, had stationed herself at the mill with a lantern and a very large rolling pin, ready to confront whatever spectre dared interfere with her flour production. She spent the entire night there, glaring at the perfectly functional mill wheel, while the rest of the village debated whether the curse was the work of witches, vengeful spirits, or, in the opinion of old Tom, them foreigners what don't appreciate good grain. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Drowsy Hollow was in a state of delightful pandemonium. Gregor was still hiding, Hester was sleep-deprived and covered in flour, and at least 3 separate villagers had begun stockpiling garlic in anticipation of supernatural attacks. And Edwina? Edwina was delighted. Her rumor mill was turning beautifully, churning out chaos like butter. But little did she know, the gears of fate were turning too. And soon, they would grind her own nonsense right back at her. Chapter 3. A case of mistaken identity. Edwina Plum had always prided herself on her sharp eye for detail, or at least for details that could be twisted into something more interesting. So when a stranger rode into Drowsy Hollow on a horse that looked as though it had seen better days, clad in a travel-worn coat and a hat pulled low over his brow, she immediately decided he was up to no good. The man dismounted outside the inn, brushing dust from his sleeves with the weary air of someone who had spent far too long on the road. He was tall, with a neatly trimmed beard and an expression that suggested he had long since run out of patience for nonsense. In other words, he was exactly the sort of person Edwina would have avoided under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances, because Edwina had already convinced herself that this was none other than Black Jack Rookwood, the infamous highwayman who had been terrorizing the countryside. Never mind that Black Jack had been hanged 3 counties over 6 months ago. Never mind that this stranger carried a satchel of official-looking documents rather than a brace of pistols. Edwina had made up her mind, and once Edwina made up her mind, reality was merely a suggestion. She watched from behind a conveniently placed rain barrel as the man exchanged a few words with the innkeeper, then stepped inside. That was all the confirmation she needed. A highwayman wouldn't just announce himself, would he? No, he would slip into town quietly, case the place, and then, mark my words, she muttered to no one in particular, that man is here to rob us blind. By the time the stranger emerged from the inn an hour later, half the village was already whispering. Edwina had made sure of that. She had informed the baker that the man was suspiciously well armed. She had hinted to the blacksmith that he had been asking about the magistrate's schedule. And she had outright told old Mrs. Thistleby that he had a wanted poster with his face on it, tucked into his coat. So when the stranger approached the market square, he was met with averted eyes, nervous murmurs, and at least one child who screamed and hid behind a cart. He frowned, clearly perplexed, but pressed on, heading toward the magistrate's office. This, of course, only confirmed Edwina's theory. "Z," she hissed to the fishmonger's wife, who had been drawn into the spectacle. "He's scouting the magistrate's place first. Probably plans to slit his throat in the night." The fishmonger's wife gasped. "But the magistrate's got that big dog." "Exactly," Edwina said triumphantly. "A man like that would have to plan for dogs." Meanwhile, the stranger, whose name was in fact Reginald Pembleton, the newly appointed tax collector, was having a very confusing day. He had expected the usual grumbling about taxes, perhaps a few creative excuses about missing livestock or sudden poverty. What he had not expected was for the entire village to freeze like startled deer every time he walked past. At the magistrate's office, things took a turn for the surreal. The magistrate himself, a portly man named Higglesworth, greeted Reginald with a strained smile and a hand that lingered suspiciously near a drawer that probably contained a pistol. "Ah, Mr. Pemberton, tax collector, moment." Reginald produced his credentials, which Higglesworth examined with the intensity of a man looking for forgery marks. Right, Higglesworth said slowly. "And you're, just in here for the taxes?" Reginald blinked. "Yes, that is my job." Higglesworth nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "Of course, only we've had some rumors about your, really their profession." Reginald stared. "I assure you, tax collection is my only profession." Higglesworth chuckled nervously. Right. And the, horsebacking part of it." Reginald was beginning to suspect he had stumbled into a village where everyone had been drinking hallucinogenic tea. "I rode here because the roads are terrible, and the coach doesn't come this far. Is there a problem?" No, Higglesworth said quickly. "Only, if you say we're planning to, rallying any one of their valuables, we'd appreciate a bit of notice." Reginald's patience, already thin, snapped. "I am here to collect taxes, not rob anyone, unless you're suggesting His Majesty's Revenue Service is a band of thieves." This, unfortunately, was the wrong thing to say to a man who had once written a very angry letter to the Crown about exactly that. Higglesworth turned pale. "I would never imply such a thing." By now a small crowd had gathered outside the office, their faces a mixture of fear and fascination. Edwina, positioned at the front like a general leading her troops, folded her arms smugly. He's threatening the magistrate now." Reginald, realizing he was not going to get anywhere with this level of absurdity, decided to cut his losses. "I will return tomorrow to begin collections. In the meantime, perhaps you can inform your villagers that I am not, in fact, a highwayman." Higglesworth nodded vigorously. Of course. We'll, spread the word." He did not, in fact, spread the word. Instead, the rumor mill churned faster. By nightfall, the story had evolved. The highwayman had threatened the magistrate into silence. He was here to case the village for a grand robbery. He had a gang waiting in the woods. He could pick locks with his JTT. Reginald, blissfully unaware of his newfound dental talents, retired to the inn, where the innkeeper served him with trembling hands and a steak that had been cut into suspiciously small, easy-to-swallow pieces, in case he decided to keep the cutlery, as the rumors now suggest. The next morning, Reginald set out to do his job, only to find that every door in the village was locked. Every single door, one. Even the church. At the first house he knocked politely. No answer. At the second, a nervous voice called out, "We've got nothing worth stealing." At the third, a shutter opened just enough for a pair of eyes to peer out. "We paid our taxes last year." Reginald sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I am a highwayman." A long pause. Then, from inside, "That's what a highwayman would say." By midday, Reginald had managed to collect exactly 0 taxes, and a headache that felt like a blacksmith was using his skull as an anvil. He decided to retreat to the inn and try again tomorrow, hoping the villagers would have come to their senses by then. They had not. Instead, they had convened an emergency meeting in the town square. where Edwina held court like a prophet of doom. "Mark my words," she declared, "that man is waiting for the cover of darkness to strike. We must be vigilant." And so, when Reginald stepped out for a breath of air that evening, he found the entire village standing in the street, armed with pitchforks, rolling pins, and, in one particularly enthusiastic case, a live chicken. He stared. They stared back. Finally, Reginald sighed. "You know what? Fine. If I'm going to be accused of being a criminal, I might as well yak tea like one." He reached into his coat. The crowd gasped, clutching their weapons tighter. And then, with a flourish, Reginald produced a ledger. "Tax exemptions," he announced, "for everyone who stops accusing me of being a highwayman." There was a long, stunned silence. Then, slowly, the pitchforks lowered. Edwina, realizing her reign of terror was at an end, tried to slip away unnoticed. She did not succeed. Because Reginald Pembleton, tax collector, and not a highwayman, had one last surprise. He had seen her whispering. He had heard the rumors. And now, with a smile that was decidedly yacht-friendly, he turned to her and said, "Ah, Miss Plum, I believe you're behind on your taxes." Edwina's face went pale, and for the first time in her life, Drowsy Hollow's greatest gossip found herself at a loss for words. Chapter 4. The Missing Cow Conspiracy. Farmer Thaddeus Brockett was not a man prone to panic. He had weathered storms, blights, and the great turnip debacle of '7 with the same stolid resignation that had been passed down through generations of Brocketts. But when he woke to find his prize dairy cow, Buttercup, missing from the pasture, even his legendary patience began to fray. Buttercup was not just any cow. She was the finest milker in 5 villages, with a hide like polished mahogany and a temperament so serene that children had been known to nap against her flank. More importantly, she was the linchpin of Thaddeus's precarious financial stability. Without her, the cheese-making operation, already hanging by a thread after last year's unfortunate incident involving a runaway wheel of cheddar and the magistrate's new hat, would collapse entirely. Thaddeus searched the pasture, the barn, and the surrounding fields with mounting unease. No broken fences, no tracks, just an empty patch of grass where Buttercup should have been drowsing. By mid-morning, word of the disappearance had reached Edwina Plum. She arrived at the scene with the air of a detective called to a high-profile murder, her sharp eyes scanning the ground as if expecting bloodstains or cryptic runes. Thaddeus, who had been about to organize a sensible search party, found himself sidelined as Edwina took charge of the investigation. "Well," she announced after a theatrical pause, "this is clearly no ordinary theft." Thaddeus blinked. "Eh?" Edwina gestured grandly at the undisturbed pasture. No footprints, no signs of struggle. Buttercup didn't wander off. She was taken, and not by any human hand. A murmur rippled through the gathering crowd. Old Tom, who had been leaning on his pitchfork with the look of a man hoping for free cheese samples, frowned. "What do you mean, not human?" Edwina's smile was the sort that usually preceded utter nonsense. "Consider the facts. Buttercup was the pride of the herd, yes? A creature of remarkable quality, and now she's vanished without a trace." She let the words hang before delivering the killing blow. "We all know what that means." The villagers exchanged nervous glances. Thaddeus, who had been about to suggest that Buttercup might have simply wandered through the gap in the far fence, the one he'd been meaning to mend for 3 seasons, hesitated. "The fair folk," Edwina declared. Silence. Then chaos. "The fair folk don't steal cows," protested the blacksmith's apprentice. "They do, if the cow's special enough," countered the miller's wife. "Maybe she trod on a fairy ring," wailed Mrs. Thistleby. Thaddeus, who had spent 40 years dealing with livestock and knew full well that cows were capable of spectacular stupidity, opened his mouth to protest. But Edwina was already spinning her tale, And once Edwina started spinning, the truth didn't stand a chance. By noon, the village had collectively decided that Buttercup had been whisked away by a troop of mischievous sprites, or possibly a lone, particularly aesthetic-minded elf. The fact that no one in Drowsy Hollow had ever seen a fairy, elf, or sprite did nothing to dampen their certainty. After all, absence of evidence was just evidence of how sneaky they were. Theories proliferated like mold on forgotten bread. Old Tom claimed his grandmother had once lost a pig the same way, vanished right out of its pen. Though now I think on it, that might have been the winter the wolves got bad. The baker's wife swore she'd heard eerie bells the night before. Clear proof of fairy involvement. The blacksmith, never one to be left out, announced that he'd once shot a horse that had kicked a fairy and been cursed with limp ever since. The horse in question was, in fact, just very old. Thaddeus, watching his sensible search party dissolve into a debate about whether fairies preferred milk or cream, sighed and went to check the far fence. There, plain as day, were Buttercup's hoofprints leading into the woods. He followed them for about 20 paces before finding the cow herself, placidly munching blackberries and looking faintly surprised to see him. She lowed in greeting, a strand of bramble dangling from her mouth like a child caught pilfering jam. Any reasonable person would have led Buttercup home, called off the hysteria, and maybe had a strong drink. But Thaddeus had lived in Drowsy Hollow long enough to know that reason had left town the moment Edwina opened her mouth. If he returned now with the cow, he'd either be accused of covering up fairy involvement or, worse, of being in league with them. So he did the only sensible thing. He left Buttercup to her berries and went to fetch a rope. Meanwhile, back in the village, Edwina's narrative was reaching new heights of absurdity. The fairy theory had branched into competing schools of thought. Why, the aesthetic abduction hypothesis. Buttercup had been taken for her beauty, possibly to be the centerpiece of some supernatural dairy. 2. The tithe theory. The fair folk were collecting payment for some forgotten village debt, though no one could agree what the debt might be. 3. The accidental portal scenario. Buttercup had stumbled through a magical door and was currently bewildering fairies with her prodigious milk output. The debate might have continued indefinitely had Thaddeus not returned, empty-handed and grave. No sign of her, he lied. But I found this. With the flair of a stage magician, he produced a strip of blue fabric tied in an intricate knot. The crowd gasped. Edwina pounced on it like a cat on a mouse. Fairy knotwork, just as I suspected. In reality, it was a scrap from Thaddeus's old shirt, artfully tangled after 5 minutes of furious knot-tying against his knee. But to the villagers, it might as well have been a signed confession from the fairy queen herself. Cows erupted. Some argued for immediate offerings of milk and honey to appease the fair folk. Others suggested ringing the church bells to drive them away. Old Tom volunteered to get drunk and negotiate, a plan that had never worked with the tax collector, but seemed worth trying with supernatural entities. Thaddeus let the hysteria build before clearing his throat. There is another way. Silence fell. A fairy cow, he said solemnly, can only be retrieved by a fairy gift. A trade of equal value. Edwina's eyes narrowed. What sort of gift? Thaddeus shrugged. Something precious. Something shiny. He had them. By sundown, the villagers had assembled a motley collection of offerings on the stump at the wood's edge. A tarnished silver spoon. The blacksmith's best horseshoe, unfinished. 3 buttons that might have been pewter, and, after some persuasion, the magistrate's favorite snuff-box, which Thaddeus planned to return later, after teaching the man a lesson about that business with the cheese. The next morning, Buttercup was back in her pasture, looking well-rested and faintly smug. The offerings were gone. The village rejoiced. Edwina preened. Thaddeus pocketed the snuff-box. The magistrate would get it back eventually. and mended the far fence. And if Buttercup occasionally wandered off in the years that followed, only to be miraculously returned after the villagers left trinkets on the stump, well, Thaddeus never complained about the sudden improvement in his collection of useful odds and ends. As for the fair folk, if they minded being blamed for a dairy cow's wanderings, they never said a word. But then, they never do. Chapter 5. The mayor's secret, that wasn't. Mayor Cornelius Pettigrew was, by all accounts, the most boring man in Drowsy Hollow. He wore brown. He enjoyed accounting. His idea of a scandalous evening was balancing his ledgers past 9 o'clock. So when Edwina Plum first suggested the mayor had a secret, the villagers reacted with the same skepticism they might show toward a fish claiming it could jump. It began on a Tuesday, laundry day, as evidenced by the rows of fluttering linens that made the village look like a ship with far too many sails. Edwina had been watching the mayor's house from behind a particularly large sheet, yellowed with age and possibly haunted, according to local lore, when she noticed something peculiar. Every Tuesday at precisely 2:30, Mayor Pettigrew would emerge from his home carrying a small wooden box, glance furtively in both directions, and hurry off toward the old mill. Now the old mill had been abandoned since the incident with the weasels and the flour sacks, and no one with any sense went near it. Yet there the mayor went, week after week, like clockwork. Edwina's imagination, never one to be constrained by reality, immediately conjured possibilities ranging from secret gambling rings to illicit cheese smuggling operations. "The man's hiding something," she announced to the gathering at the well, her voice low and dramatic. "Something he doesn't want anyone to know about." The blacksmith's wife paused in her water drawing. "Like what? That he skips pages in the tax ledger?" "Something far worse," Edwina said, her eyes gleaming with the particular joy of someone about to ruin a perfectly innocent life. "Why else would he be sneaking off to the old mill every week? With a box?" The villagers exchanged glances. It was true that the mayor's behavior was unusual. It was also true that the last time Edwina had sounded this certain about something, the village had spent a week hiding from a tax collector they'd mistaken for a notorious criminal. Still, curiosity won out over common sense, as it so often did in Drowsy Hollow. The following Tuesday, a small but dedicated group gathered to follow the mayor. They crept through the fields with all the subtlety of a herd of drunken deer, tripping over roots and shushing each other loudly. When they reached the mill, Edwina pressed her ear to the weathered door. From inside came a sound so unexpected, so utterly bizarre, that for a moment the eavesdroppers wondered if they'd stumbled into some sort of supernatural event. It was music. Faint, squeaky, and slightly off-key, but unmistakably music. Edwina's face lit up with triumph. "A secret lover," she gasped. "He's serenading someone." This seemed unlikely given that the music sounded more like a dying goose than a romantic ballad, but the villagers had committed to the bit now. Someone produced a crowbar. Why they'd brought a crowbar to a stealth mission was never explained. And with a collective shove, the door burst open to reveal Mayor Pettigrew, sitting alone on a flour-dusted crate, playing a badly tuned violin with all the grace of a man attempting to wrestle an eel. The wooden box lay open at his feet, revealing a collection of sheet music, a polishing cloth, and what appeared to be a very sad-looking rosin cake. Silence fell, broken only by the faint creak of the mill's old wheel turning in the breeze outside. The mayor blinked at the sudden audience. "Ah," he said, lowering the violin. "I suppose this explains why my house has been so quiet on Tuesdays lately." Edwina, never one to admit defeat, rallied admirably. "This is clearly a front," she declared. "No one plays the violin that badly unless they're trying to hide something." The mayor sighed and set the instrument aside. "I'm afraid the only thing I'm hiding is my complete lack of musical talent. My mother insisted all gentlemen should play an instrument. I've been practicing." The villagers peered at the violin. Up close, it was clear the instrument had suffered greatly under the mayor's ministration. The bow was missing several hairs, and there was a suspicious crack near the bridge that might explain the goose-like qualities of the music. The blacksmith's wife, who had some experience with string instruments, having once made a fiddle that was later used to scare away crows, picked up the violin with the care one might show a wounded animal. "You've been holding the bow wrong," she observed, "and I think this bit's supposed to be on the other side." The mayor looked relieved. That would explain the noise. What followed was perhaps the most surreal afternoon in Drowsy Hollow's history, as the villagers took turns attempting to teach the mayor how to play. The baker demonstrated proper bow technique, learned during his brief and disastrous stint as a street musician. The blacksmith's wife tuned the violin, mostly. Even old Tom contributed by providing a flask of something that didn't help the music, but made everyone care less about how bad it was. By sunset, the mayor could almost play Three Blind Mice without causing physical pain to his audience. The villagers, far from being scandalized, seemed oddly charmed by the revelation. There was something deeply comforting about discovering that their staid, sensible mayor had a hobby he was terrible at. Edwina, however, was not one to be swayed by sentiment. As the others drifted home, she lingered, eyeing the now empty wooden box. "There's still something you're not telling us," she accused. The mayor sighed again, heavier this time. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small, leather-bound book. "Very well. If you must know the full truth, I also write poetry." Edwina's eyes lit up with the fervor of a bloodhound catching a scent. "Scandalous verses, bawdy limericks." The mayor opened the book and read in a monotone. "Ode to a Well-Balanced Ledger, Part 1, Depreciation." He flipped a page. "Sonnet for a particularly well-stocked pantry." Edwina's expression fell. That's just accounting with line breaks." "Indeed," the mayor agreed, snapping the book shut. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I've humiliated myself enough for one day." And with that, the greatest scandal in Drowsy Hollow's history came to an end, not with a bang, but with a slightly flat violin note and a sigh. The next Tuesday, the mayor resumed his practice sessions, though now he left his door slightly ajar. Occasionally, a villager or two would stop by to offer, mostly terrible, advice or simply to listen. The music never improved much, but no one really minded. After all, as the blacksmith's wife observed, it was nice to know their mayor was human, even if his poetry suggested otherwise. As for Edwina, she briefly considered spreading rumors about the mill being haunted by the ghost of a tone-deaf minstrel, but even she had to admit some battles weren't worth fighting. Some secrets, it turned out, were better left unexaggerated. Chapter 6. The Phantom Thief of Nowhere. It began with a missing button. Just a single brass button from the coat of Jeremiah, the blacksmith's apprentice, gone from his bedside table overnight. A trivial thing, really, the sort of minor disappearance that might be blamed on a mischievous mouse or simple carelessness. But when Edwina Plum caught wind of it, she clutched her shawl with the dramatic flair of an actress in a tragedy and declared, "This is no ordinary theft." The villagers gathered around her in the square, their breath fogging in the crisp morning air. Edwina paced before them like a general surveying troops. "Consider the evidence," she intoned. A button taken with no sign of struggle. No broken locks, no scattered belongings, only a single, perfect absence. She let the words hang in the air like laundry on a windless day. "We are clearly dealing with a professional." "A professional button thief?" asked the baker's wife, who had once lost an entire tray of buns to an actual professional, in this case a particularly determined goat. "Not just buttons," Edwina corrected with a knowing nod. "I've heard reports from 3 households this week alone. Mrs. Thistleby's best thimble, old Tom's lucky horseshoe nail, the widow Marple's left slipper." She paused for effect. Always the left one. This was, strictly speaking, untrue. The widow Marple had simply misplaced her slipper, the right one as it happened, while sleepwalking during a particularly vivid dream about competitive knitting. But the villagers, now thoroughly invested in the idea of a criminal mastermind in their midst, nodded along. Even the skeptical blacksmith found himself checking his tools twice that evening. By week's end, the phantom thief had taken on legendary proportions. He, for the thief, was invariably imagined as a dashing male figure in a black cloak, despite the complete lack of eyewitnesses, could pick locks with a feather. He could scale walls like a spider. He could allegedly steal the spots off a ladybug without waking it. Most distressingly, he apparently had an inexplicable fondness for single socks. The village mobilized with all the efficiency of a militia preparing for war, if that war was being fought entirely with household items and wishful thinking. Traps sprung up across Drowsy Hollow with alarming creativity. The miller rigged a net of fishing line above his doorway. The baker dusted his windowsills with flour to capture footprints. Old Tom, after several pints of his infamous homebrew, devised an elaborate system involving a bucket of water, a length of string, and what appeared to be half a chicken coop, though how this would catch a thief remained unclear even to him. The most ambitious effort came from the blacksmith, who spent 3 days constructing an iron cage that could be triggered by stepping on a particular floorboard. He proudly demonstrated it to anyone who would listen, though the demonstration mainly consisted of the cage dropping on his own head repeatedly. His apprentice Jeremiah, who had started this whole affair by losing a button, took to carrying all his possessions in a sack tied around his waist, which made walking difficult but did wonders for his peace of mind. Edwina, meanwhile, positioned herself as the village's chief investigator. She took statements, which mostly consisted of people listing things they'd probably just misplaced, examined evidence, a suspicious leaf found near the scene of a missing spoon, and held nightly strategy meetings at the inn where the phantom thief's methods were debated with the intensity of scholars parsing ancient text. "The pattern is clear," she announced one evening, stabbing a finger at a map of the village she'd marked with small X's. "He strikes between midnight and dawn. He favors small personal items. And," she added with a significant look, "he never takes anything from locked containers." This last observation sent a ripple of excitement through the room. "So he respects locks?" asked the miller's wife. "Or he's mocking us," Edwina countered darkly. As the days passed and the traps remained unsprung, the thief's legend only grew. The missing items became more elaborate in the retelling. Not just a thimble, but a solid silver thimble gifted by a countess. Not just a horseshoe nail, but a mystical nail forged during a lunar eclipse. The widow marble slipper somehow gained gemstone embellishments in the retelling, despite being a well-darned woolen thing with a hole in the toe. The tension reached its peak when the mayor's wig stand disappeared from his dressing table. This was particularly distressing as the mayor was bald as an egg, and particularly fond of that wig stand, having carved it himself from a particularly nice bit of oak. A village meeting was called, defenses were reviewed, and watches were organized. It was during one such watch that the truth finally came to light. Jeremiah, bundled in 3 layers against the cold and clutching a lantern like a talisman, was making his rounds near the mill when he heard a faint rustling. Heart pounding, he crept toward the sound, visions of a cloaked figure dancing in his head. What he found instead was a very fat raccoon sitting atop a pile of pilfered goods, calmly washing what appeared to be the mayor's wig stand in a puddle. The creature looked up at Jeremiah with an expression of perfect innocence, the wig stand clutched in its little hands like a cherished treasure. Around it lay a hoard of missing items, buttons, thimbles, a single slipper, the left one, and at least 7 spoons. Most damning of all, the raccoon wore around its neck a makeshift necklace strung with the blacksmith's missing brass button. Jeremiah stared. The raccoon stared back. Then, with the dignity of a deposed monarch, it picked up the wig stand and waddled into the night. The next morning, the village gathered to view the evidence. The raccoon's nest, discovered in the hollow of an old oak, contained nearly all the missing items, except the spoons, which the creature had apparently traded to a disreputable crow for reasons known only to themselves. Even Edwina had to admit the truth, though she insisted the raccoon showed unusually sophisticated taste for a common scavenger. The traps were dismantled, the night watches cancelled, and the mayor's wig stand was returned after being diplomatically cleaned of raccoon saliva. As for the raccoon itself, it continued to visit the village periodically, though now the villagers made sure to secure their small valuables. Some even left out shiny trinkets on purpose, finding the creature's discerning eye oddly flattering. Edwina, never one to let facts get in the way of a good story, maintained that the raccoon might have been trained by the real phantom thief as a distraction. But even she had to admit the creature had style, especially when it began stealing only from people who had slighted it, like the baker who once shooed it away from his scraps and subsequently found his favorite rolling pin missing every third Tuesday. And so the legend of the phantom thief of nowhere faded into village lore, replaced by the very real, and much more demanding, bandit of the Oak Hollow. The traps were repurposed, the vigilance relaxed, and life in Drowsy Hollow returned to its usual rhythm, though certain villagers still checked twice before declaring something lost. Just in case. Chapter 7. The Love Triangle That Wasn't. The friendship between Elias the carpenter, Rosamond the apothecary, and Benedict the schoolteacher was the most unremarkable thing in Drowsy Hollow, which naturally made it irresistible to Edwina Plum. Every Thursday evening without fail, the three would gather at the Willow Creek Inn for what they called Philosophy Night, though it mainly consisted of Elias complaining about warped lumber, Rosamond ranting about customers who expected miracles from chamomile tea, and Benedict attempting and failing to teach them Latin declensions between sips of ale. It was wholesome, dull, and entirely above suspicion, until Edwina decided otherwise. It started innocently enough. One evening, while fetching a poultice for her aching knee, an injury sustained after tripping over her own eavesdropping ambitions, Edwina noticed Rosamond tucking a small cloth-wrapped parcel into her apron. When asked what it was, Rosamond answered plainly, "A new chisel for Elias. His birthday's tomorrow. A reasonable gift between reasonable friends." But Edwina's imagination transformed it into something far more scandalous. A chisel. Why not a handkerchief? A book? Something impersonal? A chisel was intimate. A chisel suggested knowledge of a man's actual state. By morning, the village buzzed with whispers. Rosamond gave Elias a personal gift. Edwina murmured to the baker's wife, who promptly gasped loud enough to startle the yeast out of her dough. "But Elias is courting Martha the weaver," the baker's wife exclaimed. Edwina blinked. "Is he?" "Well, no," the baker's wife admitted, "but he a be." That was enough for Edwina. By noon the tale had mutated. Rosamond was skeeling Elias away from Martha, who, upon being informed of this supposed courtship, replied, "Who?" And Benedict, poor scholarly Benedict, was caught in the middle, torn between loyalty to his friends and his own unspoken feelings for Rosamond. Never mind that Benedict had never looked at Rosamond with anything but polite exasperation. Never mind that Elias and Rosamond had been friends since childhood and had never once glanced at each other with romantic intent. The story was too delicious to resist. The villagers took sides with the fervor of gamblers at a dice game. The blacksmith's wife declared Rosamond a homewrecker, despite there being no home to wreck. The miller's apprentice swore he'd seen Benedict sighing dramatically outside Rosamond's shop. He had in fact been suffering from indigestion. Even the mayor, who usually stayed out of such matters, found himself dragged into the fray when someone suggested he should mediate the scandal. The trio, blissfully unaware of their newfound notoriety, arrived at the Willow Creek Inn the following Thursday as usual. But the atmosphere had changed. The innkeeper, usually jovial, served their drinks with the gravity of a man presiding over a duel. The other patrons pretended not to stare, while staring aggressively. Elias sipped his ale and frowned. "Why is everyone looking at us like we're ghosts?" Rosamund snorted. Maybe they finally realized you, Bjorn. Would explain why you never pay for your own drinks. Benedict, ever the observer, noticed the way the baker's wife clutched her chest when Rosamund leaned toward Elias to examine his new chisel. I think, he said slowly, there may be a misunderstanding. The misunderstanding reached its peak the next day when Marta the Weaver, who had, until then, been entirely unaware of her supposed romance with Elias, confronted Rosamund at the market. So Marta said, arms crossed, "You're the one stealing my imaginary bio." Rosamund blinked. "I'm sorry." Marta rolled her eyes. "Edwina's been telling everyone you're breaking my heart, which is impressive since I didn't know I had a heart to break where Elias is concerned." Rosamund groaned. Not this again. Determined to put an end to the nonsense, the trio devised a plan. That evening they strode into the village square arm in arm, wearing exaggerated lovelorn expressions. Rosamund sighed dramatically. "Oh, Elias, my dearest," she wailed, loud enough for the entire village to hear, "however shall we choose between you and Benedict?" Elias clutched his chest. "And how shall we choose between both of you?" Benedict, ever the scholar, pulled a scroll from his sleeve and began reading in Latin. It was a grocery list, but no one knew that. The villagers who had gathered expecting high drama stared in bewildered silence. The blacksmith's wife fainted. Old Tom, who had bet 2 chickens on Rosamund choosing Benedict, looked devastated. Edwina, sensing her fabrication unraveling, tried one last desperate ploy. "Aha!" she cried. "So you admit it?" Rosamund turned to her with a smile sweeter than poisoned honey. "Admit which? Exactly? That we're friends? That we enjoy each other's company? That you've spun an entire romance out of thin air because you have nothing better to do?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Edwina opened her mouth, then closed it. The mayor, watching from the sidelines, cleared his throat. "I believe," he said dryly, "we've all been had." And just like that, the scandal crumbled. The villagers, sheepish, dispersed. Marta went back to her weaving, declaring the whole affair the stupidest thing since that time we thought a raccoon was a master thief. The trio resumed their philosophy nights, though now with the added entertainment of making increasingly absurd declarations whenever they spotted Edwina lurking nearby. "Benedict, my darling, pass the salt. Oh, Elias, light of my life, this ale tastes like heartbreaking." Edwina, for once, had been outmaneuvered. The village moved on, but deep down she was already plotting her next scandal. After all, had anyone noticed how often the mayor visited the milliner's shop these days? Surely that meant something. But that, as they say, is a story for another time. Chapter 8. The Great Pie Scandal. The baker of Drowsy Hollow, a perpetually flour-dusted man named Bartholomew Crust, was not a man prone to drama. He rose before dawn, baked until his arms ached, and sold his goods with the weary cheer of someone who had spent too many years explaining that no, raspberry tarts were not medicinal, no matter how much one wished they were. His life was simple, his reputation spotless, until Edwina Plum decided it shouldn't be. It began with a rumor so innocuous that even Edwina didn't realize the chaos it would unleash. Overhead at the well, where all terrible ideas in Drowsy Hollow took root, she caught a snippet of conversation between the blacksmith's wife and the miller's daughter. "Did you hear?" the miller's daughter whispered. "That Widow Marple's cat got into the baker's larder last night." The blacksmith's wife gasped. And the miller's daughter continued, eyes wide, "It wouldn't touch the bowl of currants sitting out." Now, in any sensible village, this would have been dismissed as the meaningless observation it was. The cat was notoriously picky, the currants were likely covered in flour, and Bartholomew's larder was so meticulously kept that even the mice wrote thank-you notes for crumbs. But Edwina's mind did not operate on sense. It operated on potential, perpetuity. By noon, the rumor had twisted into something far more sinister. The currents weren't merely unappazing to cats. They were rotten. And not just any rotten, but scandalously rotten. The kind of rotten that suggested deliberate negligence. The kind of rotten that, if one squinted, might imply malice. Edwina, of course, was the first to squint. She cornered the mayor outside the inn, her voice low and grave. "You must act," she insisted. "Bartholomew is planning to sell tainted goods. I've heard it from 3 separate sources." The mayor, who had learned from past mistakes, frowned. "Which sources?" Edwina waved a hand. "Reliable ones. The point is, the evidence is overwhelming. A whole batch of currant pies made with spoiled fruit, set to be sold at tomorrow's market. The man is a public menace." This was, of course, utter fiction. Bartholomew hadn't even planned to make currant pies that week. He was working through a surplus of apples. But facts had never stopped Edwina before, and they didn't now. By evening, the village was in an uproar. The blacksmith's wife declared she would never risk her family's health on suspect pastries. The school teacher warned his students of the dangers of unverified baked goods. Even old Tom, who had once eaten a 3-week-old meat pie he found in a ditch and suffered no ill effects beyond existential regret, shook his head gravely and said, "Some lines you just don't cross." Bartholomew, oblivious to his sudden infamy, arrived at the market the next morning with his usual cart of goods, apple tarts, crusty loaves, and a single experimental honey cake that had puffed up in the oven like a startled souffle. He frowned when the usual crowd hesitated instead of swarming. "Everything fresh today," he called, hoping to reassure them. This was his first mistake. The villagers exchanged glances. Too fresh was the unspoken suspicion, almost as if he were overcompensating. His second mistake was offering a free sample to the miller's daughter, who recoiled as if he'd handed her a live eel. "I couldn't possibly," she stammered, backing away. By midday, Bartholomew had sold exactly 1 loaf of bread to the village drunk who was too hungover to have heard the rumors, and was starting to suspect had accidentally offended the entire town. He packed up early, bewildered, while the villagers watched in smug silence, convinced they had narrowly avoided mass poisoning. The truth only came out when the mayor, feeling guilty about the whole affair, stopped by the bakery that evening to investigate. He found Bartholomew scrubbing his already spotless counters with the fervor of a man questioning all his life choices. So the mayor began awkwardly, "About these controversial currant pies." Bartholomew stared at him. "What currant pies?" "The ones you're supposedly selling with rotten fruit." Bartholomew's expression shifted from confusion to dawning horror. "I haven't made currant pies in months. The last batch was for the harvest festival." A long silence followed as the mayor absorbed this. Then, with the air of a man who had been tricked one too many times, he sighed. "Edwina?" "Obviously Edwina," Bartholomew muttered. The next morning, the mayor called a village meeting. There, in front of the entire town, he demanded Edwina produce evidence of the tainted pies. She spluttered. Well, the cat." "The cat," the mayor repeated flatly. "And the currants, which no one actually saw," the mayor pointed out. The villagers shifted uncomfortably. The blacksmith's wife suddenly found her shoes fascinating. Old Tom pretended to be deeply engrossed in a conversation with a nearby tree. Bartholomew, arms crossed, fixed them all with a look usually reserved for burnt loaves. "So let me get this straight. You all boycotted my bakery because of a pie that doesn't exist, made with fruit that wasn't spoiled, based on the opinion of a EA cat?" The silence was profound. The resolution was swift. The mayor decreed that Edwina owed Bartholomew a public apology. She muttered something vaguely apologetic shaped under her breath. The villagers, shamefaced, flooded the bakery the next day in a frenzy of overcompensating purchases. And the cat, the infamous current snubbing cat, was officially banned from the premises, though no one had the heart to enforce it. As for Bartholomew, he took the entire affair in stride. In fact, he saw an opportunity. The following week, he unveiled a new pastry at the market. Small, round, and filled with, irony of ironies, perfectly fresh currants. He called them scandal buns. They sold out in minutes. Edwina, watching from the sidelines, could only seethe. She would get her revenge, of course. She always did. But first she needed to find a new rumor. Perhaps something about the butcher's sausages. Chapter 9. The ill-fated town meeting. The notice went up on the church door at dawn, its careful script declaring an emergency town meeting to address the recent disturbing events. No one knew who had posted it, nor precisely which events it referred to, but by mid-morning the entire village had reached the same conclusion. This was unquestionably Edwina Plum's doing. The meeting hall buzzed with nervous energy as villagers packed themselves onto creaking benches. The air smelled of damp wool and unanswerable questions. At the front of the room, Mayor Higglesworth mopped his brow with a handkerchief that had seen better days, while beside him, Edwina sat with the serene confidence of a cat who had not only heard the mice but convinced them to organize their own demise. "I call this meeting to order," the mayor announced, tapping his gavel against a wooden block with all the authority of a man trying to quiet a barnyard. "Now, can someone please explain what crisis we're meant to be discussing?" Hands shot up like startled pheasants. The blacksmith stood first, his forge-scarred hands gripping the bench before him. "It's about the wolves, isn't it? Edwina says they've started wearing clothes now." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The schoolteacher's spectacles slid down his nose in shock. "Dressed wolves?" "Not just dressed," Edwina clarified with grave solemnity. "Fashionably dressed. Mrs. Thistleby saw one in a waistcoat near the mill pond." Mrs. Thistleby, who had been nodding along, suddenly frowned. "I saw a fox with mange, actually. But now that you mention it—" "Fox? Wolf? What's the difference when they're accessorizing?" Edwina interrupted smoothly. "The point is, something unnatural is happening in our woods." Old Tom, who had been dozing against a support beam, snorted awake. "I told you them mushrooms was magic, back in '38. "This isn't about mushrooms," the miller's wife cut in. "It's clearly about the well water turning people's teeth blue. My cousin's neighbor's boy spat azure for a week." The mayor's gavel slipped from his fingers. "What?" Edwina nodded gravely. "A classic symptom of fairy meddling, though some say it's the work of that traveling tinker who passed through last month. Never trust a man with that many pockets." The room erupted into competing theories. The baker insisted the blue teeth were caused by rogue ink in the schoolhouse. Well, despite there being no ink in the schoolhouse. The blacksmith's apprentice swore he'd heard the church bell ring backward at midnight. He had in fact been asleep at the time, but dreamed it quite vividly. Someone near the back mentioned alien visitors. A suggestion so baffling the room fell silent for a full 3 seconds before carrying on as if it hadn't happened. Mayor Higglesworth, sensing controls slipping away like butter on a hot skillet, banged his recovered gavel with desperation. "Enough! Let's address one imaginary crisis at a time. Edwina, you called this meeting. What exactly are we meant to be panicking about?" All eyes turned to Edwina, who blinked with practiced innocence. "Who said anything about panic? I merely suggested we discuss the unusual occurrences. Like the fact that no two people remember last Tuesday's weather the same way." This was true in the sense that villagers disagreed on whether it had drizzled or poured, but under Edwina's guidance, the discrepancy became proof of something far more sinister. The schoolteacher gasped. "False memories. We're being gaslit by an unseen force." Or the blacksmith's wife whispered, "Some of us aren't really from our village at all. Doppelgangers walk among us. Pandemonium ensult." Neighbors who had known each other for decades now squinted suspiciously across the aisle. The baker demanded his wife prove her identity by recounting their wedding day, only to realize he himself couldn't recall what color waistcoat he'd worn. Old Tom offered to identify imposters by smell, an announcement that cleared the benches around him instantly. The mayor, now red-faced and vibrating like an overwound clock, roared for order. There are no doppelgangers, no dressed wolves, no. He paused as the church bell chose that moment to let out a single inexplicable bong. Every head swiveled upward. The bell rope hung motionless. Edwina folded her hands primly in her lap. Well, that settles that. What followed could only be described as a mass unraveling of civic decorum. The blacksmith tried to organize a militia against the sartorially gifted wolves. The schoolteacher began quizzing villagers on obscure historical facts to root out duplicates. The miller's wife started bottling well water as evidence, while her husband loudly declared he'd always hated the taste of it anyway. Through it all, Edwina sat serenely, occasionally offering helpful suggestions like, have we considered exorcism? And perhaps a controlled burn of the suspicious hedgerows? The meeting dissolved when someone shouted that the mayor's shadow had moved independently of his body. It hadn't, but in the candlelight and collective hysteria, no one could be certain. Villagers fled into the night, some clutching protective charms, others muttering about moving to the next town, over where the delusions were supposedly less elaborate. By morning, sanity had tentatively reasserted itself. The baker sheepishly recalled that his wife had in fact been correct about the waistcoat color. The blacksmith admitted the wolf story might have gotten slightly exaggerated. And the well water, when examined in daylight, proved to be perfectly clear, if one ignored old Tom's insistence that it now tasted like regret and bad decisions. Only Edwina remained steadfast in her convictions. Mass hallucinations don't just happen, she told the postmaster over tea. There's clearly something unnatural at work here. The postmaster, who had spent the night hiding in his outhouse, nodded weakly. But what do we do? Edwina sipped her tea, the very picture of thoughtful concern. We stay vigilant, we question everything, and, she added with a meaningful glance toward the mayor's house, we pay very close attention to who benefits from this confusion. The mayor, who had benefited only in the form of a stress-induced nap, would later find an anonymous note suggesting his shadow had been seen voting in his stead. The village would spend weeks jumping at ordinary noises and scrutinizing each other's table manners. And Edwina? Edwina would be proven right about one thing, though not in the way anyone expected. For on the following Tuesday the weather would in fact be remembered differently by every villager, not because of supernatural interference, but because no one in Drowsy Hollow could agree on anything anymore. And that, perhaps, was the most disturbing event of all. Chapter 10. The Mysterious Stranger Who Was Just Lost. The man who wandered into Drowsy Hollow at midday would have been unremarkable anywhere else in the world. Of average height, average build, and carrying an average-looking satchel, he had the sort of face one might forget before he'd even finished introducing himself. But in a village where the most exciting event of the past month had been old Tom's unsuccessful attempt to ferment potatoes, the stranger might as well have arrived wearing a crown and riding a dragon. Edwina Plum spotted him first, naturally. She was at her usual perch by the well, ostensibly mending a stocking, but in reality conducting her daily surveillance of everyone else's business, when the stranger paused to examine the wooden signpost at the crossroad. The sign, which had once clearly pointed the way to 3 different villages, now leaned at such an extreme angle that it suggested all directions led straight to confusion. "Can I help you?" Edwina called out, not moving from her seat. Her tone suggested she could help in the same way a fox might help chickens organize their coop. The stranger startled slightly, then offered a polite smile. "Ah, yes, I seem to have taken a wrong turn somewhere. Is this the road to Little Biddleford?" Now, any reasonable person would have simply answered the question. But Edwina's mind had already leapt past reason into the lush meadows of suspicion. Why was this man asking about Little Biddleford? What was in Little Biddleford that would interest him? And most importantly, why did his smile seem just a touch too practiced? "It is," she said slowly. "If you follow the main lane past the mill pond, though few travelers come this way without purpose." She let the implication hang like anvils on spider silk. The stranger, oblivious to the sudden tension, chuckled. "My purpose is simple. I'm hopelessly lost. My map appears to have been drawn by someone who'd never actually seen the countryside." He patted his satchel for emphasis. Edwina's eyes narrowed. "A map? Of course. Spies always carried maps." "How interesting," she murmured. "And what brings you to our little corner of the world, Mr. Smith?" the stranger supplied. "Just passing through on my way to visit family." Smith. How convenient. How utterly untrustworthy. Edwina's fingers itched to spread this delicious morsel of intrigue. "Well, Mr. Smith," she said, standing abruptly and dusting off her skirts, "allow me to escort you to the mayor. All visitors must register, you understand. Village bylaws." This was, of course, complete nonsense. The closest thing Drowsy Hollow had to visitor registration was old Tom's habit of yelling "Who goes there?" at anyone unfamiliar. But the stranger, Mr. Smith, if that was his real name, merely nodded agreeably and followed Edwina down the lane, unaware that with each step he was being marched toward what would become the most absurd interrogation in village history. By the time they reached the mayor's office, Edwina had already planted seeds of doubt in every ear along the way. The baker was told the stranger had been asking suspicious questions about grain supplies. The blacksmith heard he'd been eyeing the forge with undue interest. And by the time the rumor reached the miller's wife, the stranger was reportedly taking detailed sketches of our defensive weaknesses, which was particularly impressive given that Drowsy Hollow's primary defense consisted of a single angry goose named Mortimer. Mayor Higglesworth, who had been enjoying a rare moment of paperwork-free peace, groaned when Edwina barged in with her charge. "Not another crisis," he muttered into his hands. "Mayor," Edwina announced gravely, "this man claims to be a lost traveler, but I have reason to believe he's gathering intelligence for unknown purposes." The stranger, Mr. Smith, blinked. "I beg your pardon?" The mayor sighed. "Edwina, please tell me you haven't—" "He carries a map of the region," Edwina continued, as if this were a courtroom, and she the prosecutor. "He gave a clearly false name. And just look at how he studies the room, memorizing every detail." Mr. Smith, who had in fact been admiring a particularly crooked painting of a duck on the mayor's wall, looked appropriately baffled. "I was just—" "Silence," Edwina commanded, though no one had granted her any official authority to do so. "Mayor, I propose we conduct a thorough questioning to determine his true motives." What followed was less an interrogation and more a festival of paranoia. The blacksmith was summoned to assess whether Mr. Smith's hands showed signs of weapon training. They showed signs of being moderately clean. The school teacher attempted to trip him up with obscure historical questions. What color were King Harold's socks when he died? Even Mortimer the goose was brought in as an impromptu lie detector, though his methodology consisted primarily of pecking at anyone who moved too quickly. Through it all, Mr. Smith maintained an expression of polite confusion, answering every absurd question with patient good humor. Yes, he was traveling alone. No, he hadn't measured any bridges. Yes, he liked the countryside very much. No, he hadn't noticed whether the sheep in the north pasture were forming unusual patterns. After 2 hours of this, even Edwina began to flag. Her theories had grown increasingly elaborate. Perhaps he was a tax assessor in disguise, a royal inspector, the long-lost heir to the neighboring barony, sent to scope out his future lands. But no amount of leading questions could shake Mr. Smith's simple, dull truth. He was in fact just lost. The breaking point came when old Tom, who had been helping by periodically shouting "Aha!" from the corner, suddenly gasped. "Wait a moment, Smith, you say? Related to the Smiths of Appleby?" Mr. Smith brightened. "Why, yes, my aunt lives there." Old Tom nodded sagely. "Knew it. They've all got that nose." This startlingly mundane connection deflated the room like a punctured souffle. The blacksmith suddenly remembered he had a horseshoe waiting. The schoolteacher muttered something about grading papers. Even Edwina found herself with nothing more dramatic to say than, "Well, that's convenient." Mr. Smith, sensing his opportunity, stood and brushed invisible dust from his trousers. "If there are no further questions about my nefarious map reading or suspicious sock choices, I should really be on my way to Little Biddleford before dark." The mayor, who had spent the past hour fantasizing about retirement, waved a tired hand. "Yes, of course. Just follow the main lane past the mill pond." As Mr. Smith exited the mayor's office, the villagers who had gathered outside to watch the spectacle pretended they'd been going about their normal business all along. Only when he was safely out of earshot did the murmuring begin. "You know," the baker's wife mused, "he did have an honest face." The blacksmith rubbed his chin. "And he knew about the Appleby Smiths' noses. That's not something just anyone would know." Edwina, sensing the tide turning against her, sniffed. "Or that's exactly what a clever spy would want us to think." But even she couldn't muster much conviction. The excitement had drained away, leaving behind the faint embarrassment of people who realized they'd been shouting at a shadow. The villagers dispersed, returning to their chores and conversations, already rewriting the afternoon's events in their minds to something less ridiculous. Only Mortimer the goose seemed truly disappointed by the anticlimax. He honked balefully at Edwina before waddling off, as if to say even he had expected better from her. As for Mr. Smith, he did eventually find his way to Little Biddleford, where he regaled his relatives with the strange tale of the village that had interrogated him over a wrong turn. They laughed heartily at the absurdity, right up until the moment their local gossip overheard the story and began speculating about why Drowsy Hollow was so defensive about its secrets. But that, as they say, is another story entirely. Chapter 11. The Curse That Wasn't. It began, as most disasters do, with a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. The baker burned a batch of rolls. The blacksmith's apprentice dropped a horseshoe into the water trough. Old Tom tripped over his own doorstep, an event so common the village children no longer bothered to laugh. These were the small misfortunes of daily life, the kind of trivial annoyances that might have passed without remark in any other town. This was Drowsy Hollow, and Edwina Plum was paying attention. She called an emergency meeting at the well, her shawl clutched dramatically around her shoulders. "This is no coincidence," she declared to the gathered villagers. 3 misfortunes before noon? A clear pattern? Ein sign? The blacksmith scratched his beard. "A sign of what?" Edwina lowered her voice to a whisper. "A curse." The word hung in the air like a bad smell. The villagers exchanged glances. Curses were serious business, or at least excellent gossip. "Who would curse us?" asked the miller's wife. Edwina's eyes gleamed. "Think, who have we offended recently? The tinker we accused of witchcraft? The traveler we interrogated as a spy? The raccoon way—" "That raccoon was he stealing," the baker interrupted. "Yes, but do raccoons know that?" Edwina countered. "Or do they simply remember being persecuted?" This philosophical question sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. The blacksmith's apprentice paled. "You think the raccoon cursed us?" Edwina spread her hands. "I'm merely saying we shouldn't rule it out." By nightfall, the village had descended into full-blown curse hysteria. The baker tied garlic over his door. The schoolteacher lectured his students on ancient warding rituals. Old Tom, in a rare moment of sobriety, attempted to construct a curse breaker out of chicken wire and wishful thinking. The next morning, when the butcher found his sausages mysteriously linked together in one endless chain, the curse theory seemed confirmed. No natural force could do this, he wailed, holding up the tangled meat like evidence at a trial. Edwina nodded gravely. A clear hex, probably targeting our food supply. This launched a wave of panic buying at the market. The miller's wife stockpiled flour. The blacksmith's wife bought every candle in the shop. For light during the coming darkness, she explained, though no one knew what darkness she meant. Even the mayor got caught up in the frenzy, quietly moving his favorite armchair into the cellar just in case. Only Bartholomew the baker remained skeptical. Maybe the sausages were just poorly made, he suggested. The crowd gasped. Don't you feel it? Edwina pressed, laying a dramatic hand on his arm. The wrongness in the air, the sense that something is off. Bartholomew hesitated. Now that she mentioned it, he had stubbed his toe that morning, and his bread dough had risen slightly lopsided. And, yes, he breathed. You're right. It was a curse. With the last skeptic converted, the village threw itself into anti-curse measures with the enthusiasm of people who vastly prefer excitement to common sense. The school children made warding stones, ordinary rocks with faces drawn on them. The blacksmith forged hex nails to drive into door frames. They looked suspiciously like regular nails. The miller's wife organized a midnight chanting circle that mostly devolved into an argument about whether Begone had 1G or 2. The hysteria might have continued indefinitely, if not for 2 events. First, the mayor's wife pointed out that their cursed misfortunes were statistically no worse than any other week, a fact everyone chose to ignore because it was delivered during a rainstorm, which clearly meant the weather was part of the curse too. Second, and more decisively, old Tom's curse-breaking contraption somehow caught fire and rolled into the duck pond, where it startled up a perfectly ordinary fish, a fish that upon closer inspection turned out to be wearing the blacksmith's missing brass button around its neck like a tiny collar. The village stared at the button, then at the fish, then at each other. Edwina, never one to admit defeat, rallied first. A sign, she declared. The curse is breaking. This was, of course, nonsense. But it was the kind of nonsense the villagers desperately wanted to believe. They cheered. They congratulated old Tom on his accidental success. They completely ignored the fact that the fish had almost certainly stolen the button from the raccoon, who had probably stolen it from someone else in an endless chain of petty theft that had nothing to do with curses and everything to do with curses and everything to do with Drowsy Hollow being terrible at securing small objects. By week's end, the curse was declared lifted. The garlic came down from doors. The warding stones were repurposed as paperweights. The mayor brought his armchair back upstairs, though not without a wistful glance at his cellar setup, which he'd rather liked. Life returned to normal, or at least to Drowsy Hollow's version of it. Misfortunes still happened, but now they were just misfortunes again, dull and unmagical. Only 2 lasting changes remained. First, the butcher started double-checking his sausage casings. And second, the fish, now dubbed Sir Buttons by the village children, became something of a local celebrity, receiving regular offerings of breadcrumbs and the occasional shiny trinket, just in case it had any other cursed objects to return. As for Edwina, she simply moved on to her next project. After all, if 3 misfortunes could be a curse, then surely 4 cloudy days in a row meant something. Didn't they? Chapter 12. The gossip's sudden silence. The morning Edwina Plum stopped talking was by all accounts the most unsettling day in Drowsy Hollow's history. It began at the well, where she was usually stationed by sunrise, ready to dispense the day's first rumors with the efficiency of a town crier with a grudge. But on this particular morning, When the blacksmith's wife arrived to draw water, she found Edwina sitting silent on the stone ledge, staring into the distance as if she'd seen something no one else could. "Morning, Edwina," the blacksmith's wife ventured, expecting the usual torrent of gossip about who had been seen where, with whom, and under what suspicious circumstances. Edwina merely nodded. The blacksmith's wife hesitated. "Everything all right?" Another nod. Then silence. By noon, word had spread through the village like wildfire, if fire could burn cold with sheer bewilderment. The baker swore he'd passed Edwina in the lane and received nothing more than a faint smile. The miller's daughter claimed Edwina had watched her drop an entire basket of yarn and hadn't even speculated about what she might have been doing with that much yarn in the first place. Even old Tom, who could sleep through a hailstorm, noticed something was amiss when Edwina walked by his usual napping spot without waking him to ask what he was hiding. The villagers didn't know what to do. A silent Edwina was like a sunless sky, unnatural, unsettling, and deeply inconvenient for planning one's day. Without her daily injections of drama, the well became just a well. The market was merely a place to buy goods. The mayor's new hat went entirely unscrutinized. Panic set in by dinner time. The blacksmith convened an emergency meeting at the inn, where the villagers huddled over their drinks like conspirators without a conspiracy. She didn't say a word about the mayor's hat. The baker's wife whispered, "Not one word." The schoolteacher adjusted his spectacles. "Perhaps she's ill. Or enchanted," the miller's wife suggested darkly. Old Tom squinted into his ale. "Or finally run out of nonsense." This last possibility sent a ripple of terror through the room. If Edwina, the woman who had once spun a 3-week saga out of a missing button, had run out of nonsense, what did that mean for the rest of them? Without her wild theories or baseless accusations, her uncanny ability to turn a drizzle into a flood of intrigue, who were they? The mayor, who had been enjoying the unprecedented peace, made the mistake of saying as much aloud. "Maybe it's for the best. Life's been calmer." The villagers turned on him with horrified stares. "Calmer," the blacksmith repeated, aghast. "Life isn't supposed to be ice calm." The baker's wife added. "What's next?" the miller's daughter demanded. "Honesty? Direct communication? Healthy boundaries?" The mayor shrank back under the collective outrage. Clearly, he had misjudged the situation. By the next morning, a delegation had formed to investigate Edwina's silence. The blacksmith's wife brought soup. The schoolteacher brought a book of poetry for stimulation. The baker brought a loaf of bread that was slightly overbaked, just to give her something to criticize. They found her in her garden, methodically pruning herbs. When she saw them, she simply nodded and continued working. The blacksmith's wife cleared her throat. "We noticed you've been quiet." Edwina snipped a dead leaf from a basil plant. "Is everything all right?" the schoolteacher tried. She paused, then set down her shears with a sigh. "I've been thinking." The villagers exchanged nervous glances. Edwina thinking was somehow more frightening than Edwina talking. "About what?" the baker ventured. She looked at them, really looked at them, for the first time in days. About how none of it was true. Silence. The curses. The spies. The raccoon crime syndicate. She waved a hand. All of it just nonsense. The villagers stood frozen, as if she'd announced the sky was green. The miller's wife opened and closed her mouth twice before managing, "Well, yes, obviously." "Obviously," Edwina repeated wryly. And yet, no one knew what to say. It was one thing to annoy Edwina's stories were fabrications, but quite another to hear her admit it. It felt like the universe had tilted slightly off axis. The baker's wife recovered first. "Does this mean you'll stop gossiping?" Edwina finished. She plucked a sprig of thyme, rolling it between her fingers. I don't know. Maybe. Another stunned silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, the blacksmith stepped forward. "Edwina," he said firmly, "you can't." She blinked. "I can't." "No," the baker agreed. I can't." One by one, the villagers chimed in. The schoolteacher pointed out that her wild theories kept life interesting. The miller's wife admitted she'd started 3 friendships because of Edwina's mistaken love triangle. Even old Tom, who had suffered more than most under her rumors, shrugged and said, "What else we got to talk about?" "The weather." Edwina stared at them all. "You wanting me to lie to you?" "Not lie," the blacksmith's wife corrected. "Just elaborate. Embellish," the baker added. "Hypothesize wildly," the schoolteacher finished. Edwina looked at each of them in turn, then down at the herbs in her hands. A slow smile spread across her face. "Well," she said, straightening up with familiar purpose, "if you insist." And just like that, the world righted itself. The next morning, Edwina was back at the well, regaling anyone who would listen about how the mayor's new hat was clearly a signal to foreign agents. The blacksmith's wife nodded along, adding her own theories. The baker gasped in all the right places. The schoolteacher took notes. And if Edwina's stories were slightly more outlandish than before, if her theories spiraled into even wilder directions, well, no one complained. After all, they'd gotten a glimpse of life without her nonsense, and they'd hated it. Some lies, it turned out, were better than the truth. As for Edwina, she still had her moments of quiet reflection. Sometimes in her garden, she'd pause and wonder what would happen if she stopped spinning tales altogether. Then she'd hear the villagers whispering nearby, straining to catch the first hint of her next story, and she'd smile to herself. They needed her. And she, for better or worse, needed them right back. Chapter 13. The Aftermath of Misinformation. The morning after, Edwina Plum returned to her usual gossiping ways. The village of Drowsy Hollow awoke with the peculiar sensation of having collectively survived something, though no one could quite agree what. Some villagers chuckled over their breakfast porridge, shaking their heads at the memory of their own foolishness. Others peered suspiciously at their spoons, as if expecting them to vanish under mysterious circumstances. At the well, where truth and fiction had long mingled like cream and coffee, the baker's wife sighed as she drew water. "Remember when we thought the mayor's shadow moved on its own?" The blacksmith's wife snorted. "Or when we were convinced a fish was stealing buttons." Old Tom, who had been half listening while attempting to dislodge something from his ear, nodded sagely. "That fish was crafty, though." And so it went. The villagers moved through their routines with a newfound awareness of how easily they had been swept up in Edwina's stories. The schoolteacher, usually a man of logic, found himself hesitating before dismissing a student's claim that the classroom broom had moved on its own. The miller's wife still glanced twice at any raccoon that wandered too close to her washing line. The mayor, for his part, had developed a habit of checking his shadow whenever he passed a lantern, just to be sure. It wasn't that I believed Edwina's tales anymore. Not exactly. It was more that the line between fact and fiction had blurred so thoroughly over the years that even the most grounded among them now approached reality with a degree of skepticism. For example, when the butcher discovered a sausage missing from his shop, his first thought was not quite a thief, but a supernatural foul playing. When the blacksmith's forge fire burned unusually blue one evening, he didn't consider the quality of his coal. He briefly wondered if he'd angered a fire spirit. Even the children had adapted. Little Eliza Marple, upon seeing a crow peck at a shiny button in the road, immediately declared it evidence and ran to inform the nearest adult. The adult in question, the baker in this case, nodded gravely and pocketed the button just in case. Only Edwina herself seemed entirely unaffected by the collective introspection. She carried on as always, spinning new tales from the thinnest threads, blissfully untroubled by the chaos she left in her wake. If anything, she seemed more enthusiastic now that she knew the village would play along. The real trouble began when the villagers realized that some of them missed the nonsense. The blacksmith's wife admitted it over tea one afternoon. "Life's a bit dull without something to suspect," she muttered, stirring her cup with more force than necessary. The baker's wife nodded. "At least when we thought we were cursed, there was a sense of purpose." Even the mayor, despite his public grumbling, privately enjoyed the excitement. There was something thrilling about the possibility, no matter how remote, that the world might be stranger than it seemed. And so, without ever discussing it outright, the villagers came to an unspoken agreement. They would allow Edwina her stories. They would play along when necessary. But they would also, occasionally, roll their eyes behind her back. It was a delicate balance, but one that suited them perfectly. As for Edwina, if she noticed the shift, she gave no sign. She continued to hold court at the well, spinning her webs of intrigue, secure in the knowledge that the village needed her as much as she needed them. And if, now and then, she caught the blacksmith smirking during one of her more outlandish claims, or overheard the schoolteacher joking about the great button conspiracy of last spring, she simply smiled to herself and carried on. After all, it was a little teasing compared to the joy of a well-told tale. The stories would continue. The villagers would pretend to believe them. And life in Drowsy Hollow would remain as wonderfully bizarre as ever. Some things, it seemed, never changed. Chapter 14. The Gossip's Redemption, maybe. Edwina Plum woke with an unusual feeling, the prickling discomfort of conscience. It had been a slow and creeping realization over the past few weeks. The way villagers now exchanged knowing glances when she launched into a particularly elaborate tale. The muffled laughter that sometimes followed her pronouncements. The fact that old Tom had started calling her Madam Minister of Misinformation to her face. For the first time in her life, Edwina wondered if she had gone too far. The thought was so unsettling that she nearly spilled her morning tea. She sat at her small kitchen table, staring into the steaming cup as if it might offer answers. Outside, the village of Drowsy Hollow was stirring to life, blissfully unaware that its chief purveyor of nonsense was experiencing a crisis of credibility. "I should set the record straight," she announced to her empty cottage. The words sounded foreign in her own voice. Determined, Edwina marched to the well, where a small crowd had already gathered. The villagers fell silent as she approached, their expressions a mix of curiosity and wary expectation. "Good morning," Edwina began, then paused. She hadn't planned what to say next. The blacksmith's wife raised an eyebrow. "No scandal today?" Edwina took a deep breath. "Actually, I've been thinking about all the stories I've told over the years." A ripple of unease passed through the group. The schoolteacher adjusted his spectacles. The baker's wife clutched her water bucket tighter. "And?" the miller prompted. "And," Edwina continued, "I think it's time I admitted that some of them may have been slightly exaggerated." The silence that followed was so complete that the distant moo of Farmer Thaddeus's cow sounded like a thunderclap. Old Tom, who had been dozing against the well, jerked awake. "Eh? Who died?" "No one," Edwina said quickly. "I'm just saying, the cursed fish, the raccoon crime syndicate, the mayor's sentient shadow. None of that was real." The villagers exchanged glances. The blacksmith cleared his throat. "We know." "You know?" Edwina blinked. The baker's wife shrugged. "Course we know. We're not daft." "But you played along?" Edwina protested. The schoolteacher smiled. It was fun. This revelation struck Edwina like a poorly aimed horseshoe. All these years, she had believed herself the puppet master of village gossip, when in reality, the villagers had been humoring her. The ground beneath her feet felt suddenly unstable. "I see," she said faintly. An awkward silence descended. The villagers shuffled their feet, unsure what to do with a penitent Edwina. It was like watching a cat apologize for knocking over a vase, unsettling and vaguely unnatural. The mayor, sensing an opportunity, stepped forward. "Well, now that we've cleared that up, perhaps we can all—" "But—" Edwina interrupted, holding up a finger as a new thought struck her. "That doesn't mean there aren't real mysteries in this village." The crowd groaned. "Take the missing socks, for instance," she continued, warming to her topic despite herself. 3 households this week alone, and always the left one. That can't be coincidence." The miller's wife threw up her hands. "For pity's sake, Edwina. And the butter churn that mysteriously stops working every full moon." "That's because Martha forgets to grease it," the blacksmith's wife shouted. Edwina waved this away. "And what about—" She stopped abruptly. The villagers followed her gaze to where a small, ragged figure stood at the edge of the square, a traveling minstrel by the look of his patched cloak and lute case. He was studying the village with an odd intensity, his eyes darting from building to building as if memorizing them. Every head swiveled back to Edwina. "No," the mayor said firmly. "But—" "No." Edwina closed her mouth. For exactly 3 seconds. "You have to admit," she murmured, "he does look suspicious." And just like that, the spell was broken. The villagers erupted into arguments, some agreeing with Edwina, others chastising her, a few already speculating about the minstrel's possible connections to recent sock disappearances. Edwina listened to the chaos with a strange mix of guilt and satisfaction. Old habits, it seemed, died hard. As for the minstrel, he would turn out to be exactly what he appeared, a perfectly harmless musician who would, over the next week, become thoroughly sick of people asking if he had any interest in socks. But that was a story for another day. Edwina walked home that evening with a lighter step. She had tried to reform. Really, she had. But the villagers didn't want truth. They wanted stories. And who was she to deny them? Still, as she passed the well, she paused. Perhaps, she thought, she could aim for slightly more plausible tales moving forward. Maybe. Probably not. Smiling to herself, Edwina Plum continued on her way, already composing tomorrow's scandal in her head. Chapter 15. The Legend That Lingers. Years rolled through Drowsy Hollow like gentle tides, smoothing the edges of memory, but never quite washing away the stories. Edwina Plum had long since passed into legend herself, her cottage repurposed as the village archive, though no one could agree whether this was ironic or fitting. But her tales lived on, not as mere recollections, but as something closer to gospel. The children of the village grew up on stories of the phantom thief who had never existed, of the raccoon overlord who may or may not have orchestrated the great button heist. Teenagers dared each other to visit the old mill at midnight, where the mayor's shadow was said to dance independent of any light source. Newcomers to the village were solemnly warned about the fairy tax, an imaginary levy that, according to tradition, required leaving a shiny trinket by the stump at the wood's edge every harvest season. No one admitted this practice had started as a joke. At the Willow Creek Inn, now run by the miller's grandson, travelers could order a scandal bun in honor of Bartholomew the baker. The current baker, a no-nonsense woman named Gertrude, had tried to remove the item from the menu, only to face such outcry that she grudgingly kept it, though she insisted on adding a footnote to the chalkboard. Contains no actual scandal, or occurrence most days. And then, please. Even the animals played their part. Every few years, a particularly clever raccoon would wander into town, and the villagers would watch it with wary respect, whispering about whether this might be the original bandit of the Oak Hollow's descendant. The fish in the duck pond had long since gone belly up, but Sir Button's legend had grown to such proportions that visitors were sometimes told he'd been the size of a pig, with eyes like polished coins. The truth, as it often does, had crumbled under the weight of a good story. On one such evening, with the autumn air crisp and the smell of wood smoke curling through the lanes, A young girl named Liza sat with old Tom, now Janshinton Tom, though no one dared call him that to his face, listening to tales of the village's golden age of nonsense. But were the wolves really dressed in waistcoats? Liza asked, swinging her legs from the bench outside the inn. Tom, who had been a boy during the height of Edwina's reign, took a slow sip of his ale. Some say yes. Some say no. Me? He leaned in, his breath smelling faintly of yeast and nostalgia. I think they wore hats too, little ones, with feathers. Liza's eyes widened. Inside the inn, Gertrude rolled her eyes and slid another scandal bun onto a plate. "You're corrupting the youth," she called through the window. Tom winked at Liza. "That's the point." And so it went. The stories grew taller, the details richer, the moral of it all more elusive with each retelling. But if, on certain quiet evenings, you listened closely enough, you might hear the villagers laugh just a little too hard at their own tall tales. You might notice how the blacksmith's apprentice still checked his pockets for missing buttons after seeing a raccoon. You might catch the mayor, the new mayor, a practical woman with no patience for nonsense, glancing at her shadow when she thought no one was looking. For all their laughter, for all their eye-rolling, the people of Drowsy Hollow had learned something precious from Edwina Plum's reign of harmless lies. That a story didn't have to be true to matter. That a little nonsense could make the world softer at the edges. That sometimes a village needed its myths as much as its facts. And so they kept them alive. Not because they believed, exactly, but because they wanted to. As the last light faded over the rooftops, Liza scampered home, her head full of waistcoated wolves and button-hoarding fish. Tomorrow, she would repeat the tales to her friends. Someday, she might tell them to her own children. And so the legend lingered. Just as it always would.